a few chapters later, he has a new hope. I guess that's kind of a Star Wars reference, so I suppose, subconsciously. Hey everybody, Deathblade here, also known as Jeremy Bai. I'm doing a little bit of a different video today. I'm going to be talking about Bastion by Phil Tucker. I'll pull that up right here before I forget to do so. There is a link in the description below and the pinned comment to this book if you have not read it. Now, I do highly recommend this book. I thought it was great. I recommended this book in a previous video that I will link right here. And in that video, I talked about why I decided to stop doing book reviews on my channel, at least for the time being and maybe permanently. So this video is not going to be a review of Bastion, but I will reiterate what I said in the previous video, which is that I really liked it a lot. There are some things that I perhaps didn't like about it or could be critical of, but not enough that I wouldn't give it a 5-star. In fact, if you go to Amazon and you search through these 2100 ratings, and there's not as many reviews, but if you go search through them, you will find my review in there somewhere. I don't know where it is exactly, but I did give it a 5-star review, and I did really enjoy this book, and I think you will too. You know, I go down here, if you want to go, you can go check out all the other reviews. You know, there's plenty of them. I really disagreed with some of the negative things that people said in the reviews. If you notice, the very top review here is a 3-star review, which I find really annoying. Amazon does this all the time. From what I can tell, is they put a negative review in the top spot. Now, I know people have different views of what numbers of stars mean in reviews. This person labeled their review, the main character is an idiot, so I think you can tell that it's a negative review from there. I think it's a bad review and I don't like it. The sentiments expressed in this review do get echoed in some of the other reviews, and again, I don't really agree with them, but this video isn't where I'm going to get into all of that. So what is the point of this video? Well, Bastion was obviously very well received. I've seen a lot of people talking about it in online forums and Reddit and whatnot. I thought it would be good to take something that was really well received and try to get into the nuts and bolts of why it was well received, you know, to improve my own craft as a writer. I've been getting comments on my YouTube channel and on Twitter and other places on social media, people asking for my opinion about how to write and things like that. And so I think, who knows, maybe this video will be one in a series of videos. I'm not really sure. I thought it would benefit both me and some of you out there if I kind of tried to break down this novel and go a little bit behind the scenes to figure out what makes it tick. What I did was, as you can see in this document here, I went through the novel and I identified basically what was happening in each chapter, and I created an outline of the novel, and then I tried to decide how it was broken up into larger sections. The goal being to figure out what was the author thinking in terms of the plot structure. You know, there's different things you can consider when you're talking about planning out a novel, and plot structure is one of them. And so I thought, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to see if I can figure out what's going on with Bastion in terms of the plot structure. But that's not it with this video. I actually reached out to the author, Phil Tucker, and he graciously spent some time with me to actually answer my questions. So after I had done all the work of making my own guess about what he was thinking in terms of the plot structure, he actually revealed to me very simply what went into his design process, I guess you could say. So what I'm going to do in this video is, first I'm going to explain to you my take on the plot structure, and then Phil's take. And then your job from this point forward is to guess whether or not I'm right. So pay attention to how I break down the plot structure of Bastion, and then I'll reveal to you what Phil told me, and then we can see how close they get. Obviously, there will be spoilers in this video. I am not going to go through chapter by chapter or even a section by section explanation of everything that happens, because it's 80 chapters long. It's a very long read. So if you have not read Bastion, what's going to happen after this might not make very much sense. So perhaps if you haven't read it, go check it out, then come back to watch this video later. But don't forget about it, you know, save it somewhere so that you remember to come back and check it out. So if you look at this document, as you can see, I basically ended up guessing that it was broken down into 5 acts. A very key point which influenced my entire way of thinking is this section right here. Now, if you have read the novel, which hopefully you have if you're watching this video, you will recognize that right in the middle of the novel, there's a character, a super ultra powerful character who comes to the city of Bastion and attacks it, and it just kind of messes up the whole city and it changes almost everything. This is the major turning point in the story, and so I identified that as being the midpoint of the story. Now, midpoint is something you will find in a lot of different plot structures. Probably one of the most common that I think everybody has heard of is the 3-act structure. Even if you have not done any sort of like study or research about stories, you've probably heard of 3-act structure. It's really common, especially in movies, but you'll also find it in books as well. What's a little less commonly talked about and known about is the 5-act structure. As you can see, going back into my breakdown, I did break it down, as I said, into 5 acts. And part of that was because, see right here, it says turning point crisis. And right here in the 3-act structure as well, it has a midpoint, a big twist. And so because this midpoint happens right here, this big twist, it got me thinking that it must be one of these common plot structures that centers around the midpoint. And that kind of shaped my thinking as I went into analyzing the story. The way I analyzed it was the main character, Scorio, is reincarnated. He goes through his gauntlet run, then he has to survive after being outcast, and then he makes his way to the city and kind of just tries to survive. This all comprises Act 1, and it kind of just all made sense to me, and it comes right before this interlude. In this case, the interlude is an obvious separation between 2 sections of the story, because in the next story, everything changes. The main character makes friends with Naomi. She's called the Nightmare Lady at first, and she's like really scary and overpowered and stuff, but he eventually becomes friends with her and she becomes an ally. Then he reunites with his friends who he originally met in the Gauntlet run. And for the next, 10 or so chapters, 10 or 15 chapters, I guess, he does a few variations of different things, doing research and attempting to learn more about his past lives and whatnot. But ultimately, I broke this down into training with his friends. It's broken up by this interlude here where we meet this character who's super ultra powerful. And then the story continues a little bit and then we reach that midpoint, which I talked about before, when that character attacks, just like destroys everything. That changes the entire story. From that point on, Scorio is able to join the academy. So I have the 3rd act being made up of this attack and his academy life. The academy life, at first, everything is pretty good. Everything is, challenging, but he has this sense that he's finally making his way in the world and he can do everything that he wanted to do. But then everything kind of falls apart. He gets sponsored by this House Chimera when, in fact, he was instrumental in an illegal attack on them earlier in the story. And so that comes around to bite him in the butt and everything falls apart. Everything kind of starts to go bad. But then about a few chapters later, he has a new hope. I guess that's kind of a Star Wars reference, so I suppose, subconsciously. He figures out a way that maybe he can kind of turn things back around and get on the path to victory again. And that kind of goes on as he's trying to do all these different things to claw his way back to the top. And I have this interlude and this interlude all in this 4th act, which is basically things going bad and him trying to scramble out and get to the top, but ultimately nothing really works as he wants it to. My 5th act is the final gauntlet run. So he goes back to the same gauntlet that he participated in the 1st act of the story, and he comes out triumphant, and that's the end of the story. So that's how I broke down the story into 5 acts. Now, let's get into what Phil Tucker told me. Guess what? Here's the thing. Basically, Phil actually broke it down into 4 acts. And in terms of the overall plot structure, he was basically using the hero's journey. I think it's pretty interesting because the last video I recorded and released was about a novel series that I translated, and my theory in that video is that novel series actually also follows the hero's journey. I've been a fan of the hero's journey for a long time. I studied it in college. I haven't talked much about my college life, but I actually studied animation. And part of animation is acting and it's writing and all kinds of things. So I studied the hero's journey, and I think it was either an acting class or it might have been a writing class. I forget at this point. But the point is I've been aware of the hero's journey and been a fan of it for a long time. So when Phil told me that, I was actually kind of surprised. Like, wow, I didn't notice this. He basically said that the 4 acts that he envisioned was the first one basically exactly the same as mine, the setup and then being lost out in the wilderness. The 2nd act was his progression and learning, and it ended with that attack that I mentioned. The 3rd was his growth in the academy and then losing the house sponsorship and hitting rock bottom. And then the 4th was the final stretch to the end. So really the main plot beats, I would say I kind of identified the same, but that midpoint really threw me off. The funny thing is that I mentioned this to Phil and I was like, oh yeah, I was saying how I identified that as the midpoint. He revealed to me that midpoint attack didn't have anything to do with the hero's journey in terms of the overall plot. So I guess it was just kind of an interesting convergence, and that threw me off the trail of the hero's journey. in retrospect, looking back, the hero's journey stuff is really, really obvious. For example, the mentor that he gets early on in the story, the pieces were all there, and I even did notice them, but I really was thrown off by that whole midpoint thing. And incidentally, here, I meant to pull this up earlier, and I forgot to, my bad. This is a graphic of the 5-act structure, or no, I think I did pull this up earlier. No, I showed this one earlier, I think. This is a little bit more fancy one, but it has the same kind of thing. Now, one interesting thing that I do have to point out is that if you're using the 5-act structure, the climax is supposed to happen somewhere toward the middle to end of Act 3, whereas I had this taking place at the beginning of Act 3. And when I was breaking down this act structure, I knew the midpoint should be in the middle of this act, but I couldn't quite make it work. I knew that the previous act ended either here or here, and I was thinking, oh, maybe I should tack this midpoint onto the previous act, but then that would be way too long. So I was like, I'll put it on to the beginning of this new one. And so that really did kind of throw off my whole theory as I was trying to guess the plot structure. And incidentally, here is the hero's journey graphic, which I probably should have brought up earlier as well. Something else worth mentioning is that Phil recommended this book, which is, you can see I bought it a couple days ago because I had never read it. Something else worth mentioning is that Phil recommended this book here, which, as you can see, I actually bought it a couple days ago because I hadn't read it before. And this book is a book regarding outlining and by extension plot structure. And this book is heavily based on character arcs. And Phil also made heavy use of that. He actually showed me his full outline for the character arcs in Bastion, and it kind of put everything into perspective for me in terms of how he laid it out. And his vision for the story wasn't just like one column with this is what happens in the story. It actually was multiple columns with different things happening and start being brought up and resolved and whatnot. And so in the end, the breakdown of Bastion is that it is a 4-act story that's loosely based on the hero's journey, and my vision of the 5-act structure for this story is incorrect but close to the final version. And with that, I will conclude my analysis of the plot structure of Bastion, Immortal Great Souls Book 1. I hope this was helpful to you. I think in the end what this emphasized to me is that I am not an expert, and for me to go into a story and try to figure out how the author was structuring it is going to be difficult. And in fact, it leads me to question if it's possible to do that at all. One thing you will find when you read books or watch videos or whatever it is, people trying to teach story structure, is they will often say, okay, look at this 3-act structure or 5-act structure, or there's, the 22-point plot structure or hero's journey or whatever it is. And they'll bring up examples. This is how it's used in this book. This is how it's used in that movie. Well, it leads me to question, how accurate are those breakdowns? I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying that sometimes it's easy to take your vision of how a story could be broken up and apply it to a story and then be incorrect about it. That's exactly what happened to me. What are your thoughts about Bastion? What are your thoughts about story? What are your questions? Please leave them below. Again, I hope this video was helpful. And if you have any suggestions for similar kind of videos, I look forward to them. I'm thinking maybe in the future I could do more to analyze plot structure, character development, and even setting and world building in different books and series. That kind of stuff really fascinates me, and it not only helps me to improve myself, but I think it could help some of you to improve as well, both in terms of maybe your own creative process or your enjoyment as you read these books and kind of try to figure out why you like certain books and maybe why you don't like other books. That's it for this video. I will see you next time. Godsilla.